Impossible, the Arbiter stopped at 7 for every predator in recorded history. Then your machine's never met a human before. It's still increasing, it doesn't know where the limit is. That's because survival isn't a number.
Sweat stung his eyes, mixing with the metallic tang of old blood in his mouth. He didn't feel like a species representative. He felt like a mechanic nursing a 3-day hangover. The alien machine looming above didn't look like a god. It just smelled like burnt copper and judgment. The air in the evaluation chamber was too thin, laced with a faint, sterile odor that reminded Bennett of industrial bleach and static electricity. It dried the back of his throat and made his eyes water. He blinked hard, trying to clear the blurry edges of his vision, and shifted his weight from one aching leg to the other. His heavy canvas boots scuffed against the polished obsidian floor, the sound harsh and loud in the cavernous room. Bennett scratched at a patch of dry skin on his jaw, the rough stubble rasping loudly against his calloused fingertips. He wasn't a diplomat. He was an engineer, second class, currently wearing a jumpsuit stained with hydraulic fluid that smelled faintly of ammonia. But when the Galactic Transit Authority pulled his freighter out of slipspace, they hadn't asked for a diplomat. They had asked for a biological sample of the newly discovered species. Bennett had simply drawn the short straw. Standing a few yards away was Administrator Blake. That wasn't the alien's real name, of course, but the standard-issue cortical translator jammed behind Bennett's left ear mapped alien phonemes to familiar Western nomenclature to prevent cognitive fatigue. Blake was a towering, spindly creature, possessing entirely too many joints and skin that resembled bruised, purple parchment. He wore a high, restrictive collar of brushed steel that seemed to painfully dig into his neck every time he swallowed. "Stand directly on the induction plate, Bennett," Blake said. The translator rendered the alien's clicking mandibles into a crisp, flat baritone, though it couldn't filter out the wet, clicking sound of his inner mouthparts. "I'm on it," Bennett muttered. He tapped the heel of his boot against the slightly raised, grooved metal disc beneath him. "How long does this take?" "I left a localized fusion manifold decoupled on my ship, and if my crew touches it, we're going to lose the port engine." Blake did not look at him. His large, lidless black eyes remained fixed on the massive structure, dominating the center of the room. The Arbiter operates at its own pace. It is calculating your species' threat index, the apex quotient. Bennett let out a slow, heavy exhale. "Right, the threat index. Because my freighter is such a menace to galactic peace. It is a mandatory precaution," Blake replied, his tone dripping with bureaucratic exhaustion. He steepled his long, multi-jointed fingers together. "The galaxy is fragile. Biological volatility must be cataloged. The Arbiter evaluates predatory instinct, physiological lethality, and psychological aggression. It rates species on a scale of 1 to 7. Bennett rubbed the bridge of his nose. A dull headache was beginning to pulse right between his eyes, a souvenir from the cheap synthetic whiskey he'd consumed before they were boarded. "And what happens if a species gets a 7? Blake's posture stiffened. The purple skin around his neck flushed a deep, bruised gray. A 7 has only been recorded once in the history of the Coalition. The apex predators of the Orion sector. They were biologically engineered killing machines. Acidic blood, subdermal plating, hive-mind tactical capability. It took 3 stellar cycles and the cracking of their homeworld to eradicate them." Blake finally turned his massive black eyes toward Bennett, looking him up and down with obvious disdain. "You have exposed flesh, blunt teeth, forward-facing eyes, but no natural weaponry. Your atmospheric tolerance is remarkably narrow. I expect you will score a 2, perhaps a 3, if your kind is prone to irrational panic." "Irrational panic is pretty much our main export," Bennett said dryly, digging his hands into his grease-stained pockets. Before Blake could respond, the Arbiter woke up. There were no grand glowing lights, no holographic avatars or soaring orchestral chimes. The machine was simply a monolithic block of dark, pitted metal, towering 3 stories high, covered in dense, brutalist ridges. When it activated, Bennett felt it before he heard it. The fillings in his molars began to vibrate. A low, grinding hum vibrated up through the soles of his boots, traveling up his spine and settling deep in his chest. The air pressure in the room abruptly dropped. Bennett's ears popped, and the sudden smell of ozone and burning dust filled his nostrils. He gagged slightly, tasting pennies on the back of his tongue. "Do not step off the plate," Blake warned, taking a very deliberate step backward. Deep within the dark metal monolith, heavy mechanical relays began to snap. It sounded like thick tree branches breaking in a quiet forest. Crack, crack, crack. The machine wasn't just computing, it was physically reconfiguring itself, drawing power from the very grid of the station. The floor beneath Bennett grew freezing cold, frost instantly webbing out from the edges of the metal disc. Bennett shivered, his thin jumpsuit offering zero protection against the sudden drop in temperature. He crossed his arms over his chest, shivering. "You couldn't have put a space heater in here?" he grumbled, his breath misting in the air. Then, the invisible weight hit him. It felt like walking face first into a sheet of thick glass. Bennett gasped, stumbling back half a step, but an unseen pressure locked around his limbs, holding him rigidly in place. It wasn't a physical restraint. It was a profound, crushing heaviness inside his own skull. The machine was inside his head. The intrusion was entirely ungraceful. It didn't sift through his thoughts like a gentle breeze. It tore through his synapses like a rusted crowbar prying open a locked crate. Bennett squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a sharp, ugly grunt of pain. A hot spike of agony drove itself behind his right eye, and a warm trickle of blood began to seep from his left nostril. Threat assessment initiated. A voice echoed, not in the room, but directly against the wet tissue of Bennett's brain. It was a mechanical, grinding sound, devoid of emotion, operating purely on cold, hard logic. He expected the machine to look at human history. He expected it to pull up the data packets his ship's computer had transmitted to the station, the global wars, the nuclear detonations, the treaties, the grand, sweeping narratives of humanity's bloody past. It didn't. The Arbiter didn't care about history. It cared about biology. It cared about survival. It bypassed the abstract and dug its cold fingers into Bennett's raw, personal memory. The room around him vanished, replaced by the suffocating darkness of a collapsed mining tunnel on Ceti Alpha. The memory was 10 years old, but the sensory data was ripped into the present with terrifying clarity. Bennett couldn't breathe. The air in his memory was thick with pulverized rock and the terrifying smell of ruptured gas lines. He felt the crushing weight of the durasteel beam pinning his legs. He felt the terrifying, frantic hammering of his own heart, a biological drum beating against a ribcage that felt too fragile. Physical durability. Suboptimal, the Arbiter's voice, ground out inside his head. Bone density. Fragile. Muscle mass. Inefficient. In the memory, Bennett wasn't being a hero. He was weeping. Dust and tears streaked his face as he desperately dug at the shattered rock with bare, bleeding hands. His fingernails were torn back, exposing the raw, agonizing nerve endings, but he didn't stop. Beside him, in the dark, Sullivan was screaming. Sullivan's leg was caught, crushed to a pulp. Bennett remembered the taste of the dirt in his mouth. He remembered the blinding, animalistic panic, but he also remembered the dark, ugly stubbornness that had settled into his gut, a refusal to die in the dark. He remembered finding a jagged piece of metal, gripping it with hands slick with his own blood, and using it to painfully, brutally sever the remains of Sullivan's pinned leg so he could drag the man out. The Arbiter paused. The memory shifted. The machine was analyzing the psychological data, dissecting the neurochemical flood of adrenaline, cortisol, and endorphins that had kept Bennett conscious when the pain should have triggered system failure. Pain tolerance. Contradictory. Neurological overrides detected. Willful ignorance of structural damage. The memory violently ripped away, replaced by another. Bennett was younger, standing in a freezing downpour outside a colony hab unit. The cold was a physical entity, biting into his skin, numbing his fingers to useless lumps of meat. He was holding a wrench, shivering violently, staring down a pack of feral, engineered guard dogs that had broken loose from a neighboring sector. Bennett wasn't a soldier. He was terrified. He remembered the smell of wet fur, the hot, rancid breath of the lead animal. He remembered the way his hands shook so badly he could barely hold the wrench. But when the animal lunged, Bennett didn't freeze. The fear didn't paralyze him. It weaponized him. He swung the heavy steel wrench, feeling the sickening, wet crunch of bone as it connected with the animal's skull. He swung again, and again, long after the beast was dead, fueled by a dark, unhinged hysteria, his own blood mixing with the rain. Predatory response. Reactive. Escalation parameters. Infinite. The Arbiter noted, the cold voice vibrating against Bennett's skull. Subject lacks natural weaponry, yet converts environmental detritus into lethal implements. Aggression is not a baseline state. It is an unbounded variable. The machine dug deeper, accelerating. It flashed through humanity's biological quirks. It tasted the capsaicin humans used to spice their food, a chemical weapon evolved by plants to deter predators, which humans consumed for recreation. It analyzed the ethanol Bennett had consumed hours ago, recognizing it as a neurotoxin that the human liver stubbornly filtered out just so the brain could enjoy a temporary malfunction. It observed the human immune system, a hyper-aggressive biological war zone that would sooner destroy its own host with a fever than surrender to an infection. The Arbiter was finding contradictions that violated basic evolutionary logic. Predators evolved to kill efficiently, preserving energy. Prey evolved to hide or run. Humans did neither. They endured. They walked their prey to exhaustion across burning savannas. They survived catastrophic trauma by simply refusing to go into shock. They were soft, fleshy, vulnerable creatures that possessed a horrifying, terrifying capacity to endure pain, and an even more terrifying capacity to inflict it when backed into a corner. Bennett stood on the metal plate in the real world, his head thrown back, a low, guttural groan escaping his throat. Blood was now steadily dripping from his nose, splashing onto the frosted metal disc. His muscles were locked, twitching violently under the strain of the neural link. In the corner of the room, Administrator Blake watched with growing unease. The Arbiter was vibrating violently. The deep, rumbling hum had escalated to a high-pitched, mechanical shriek. Steam was beginning to vent from the monolith's upper ridges, smelling of melted copper and ozone. "Arbiter?" Blake called out, his translation collar struggling to keep up with the rapid, nervous clicking of his mandibles. "Is there a malfunction in the scan?" The machine did not answer. It was entirely consumed by the paradox of the creature standing before it. A creature that was simultaneously fragile prey and an apocalyptic apex predator. A creature that survived not through superior strength, but through sheer, psychotic spite. With the sound of a heavy steel door slamming shut, the unseen pressure crushing Bennett's mind evaporated. He immediately collapsed. His knees hit the frosted metal plate with a dull thud, and he caught his weight on his hands, gasping for breath. The air tore at his lungs. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and spat a glob of bloody saliva onto the dark metal floor. His head felt like it had been hollowed out and filled with angry hornets. The high-pitched shriek of the Arbiter slowly powered down, returning to the low, grinding hum. The frost on the floor began to melt. Bennett stayed on his hands and knees for a long moment, shivering, waiting for the room to stop spinning. He reached up with a trembling, grease-stained sleeve and wiped the blood from his upper lip. "Christ," he rasped, his voice sounding like sandpaper. "You people could really use some bedside manner." He slowly pushed himself up, his joints popping, and staggered slightly before finding his balance. He glared at the dark monolith, then turned to look at Administrator Blake. Blake seemed utterly unconcerned with Bennett's physical state. The tall alien was staring intently at a smooth, angled console that had extended from the base of the Arbiter. The screen was a deep, liquid black, waiting to display the final diagnostic score. A minor physical reaction, Blake dismissed, though his four-fingered hands were twitching nervously at his sides. The scan is thorough. It must fully map the neural pathways to ensure the threat index is entirely accurate. As I said, a 2 or a 3. Bennett pulled a crumpled, slightly damp pack of cigarettes from his breast pocket. He knew they were probably a fire hazard in an oxygen-regulated station, but he didn't care. His hands were shaking too much to care. He put one between his lips, but couldn't get his cheap plastic lighter to spark. He gave up, just leaving the unlit cigarette dangling from his mouth, chewing on the filter to ground himself. "Just give me the score so I can go," Bennett muttered, rubbing his temples. The Arbiter's console flickered. The deep, synthetic voice of the machine resonated not in their minds, but through the chamber's physical audio systems. It sounded heavy, tired, almost. "Evaluation complete." The machine ground out. Blake stepped closer to the screen, his mandibles clicking in anticipation. Readout. Display the apex quotient. Subject. Human. Biological designation. Terran. The screen flashed. A bright, glowing white numeral appeared on the black glass. "San?" Blake let out a short, clicking sound that the translator rendered as a scoff. As predicted, a 3. Barely above the local fauna of a garden world. Aggressive, perhaps, but ultimately fragile and inconsequential. "I will authorize your transit visas, Bennett. Try not to hurt yourselves on the station's automated walkways." Bennett sighed, turning to step off the plate. "Thanks. Can I get a towel or something for my nose?" "Evaluation incomplete," the Arbiter suddenly boomed. The sheer volume of the voice rattled the heavy light fixtures above them. Bennett froze. Blake whipped his head back to the screen, his large black eyes widening. "What do you mean incomplete?" Blake demanded, his voice dropping its bureaucratic smugness. "The quotient is 3. The biological scan is finished." "Biological limitations recognized," the machine stated. The numeral 3 on the screen flickered, distorted by a wave of static, and then vanished. "Psychological adaptability, unbounded, calculating compound threat." The screen lit up again. "Sue," Blake frowned. "A 4. That is unusual for a non-armored species, but acceptable." The screen flashed before Blake even finished his sentence. "Ooh, wait," Blake said, taking a step back. 5 is a predator class rating. That implies a species capable of localized extinction events. Arbiter, recalibrate. Lack. The machine didn't pause. The room's temperature began to plummet again. The heavy relays inside the metal monolith began to snap and crackle, faster this time, struggling to process the math. "See." Blake let out a high-pitched, warbling sound of pure distress. He stumbled backward, his long, multi-jointed legs getting tangled. "7! It's at 7! Stop the calibration!" Arbiter, halt processing. "There are no 7s. The Draxian hive was a 7. This is a flesh-based biped." Bennett stood on the plate, chewing slowly on his unlit cigarette. He looked at the screen, then at the panicking alien, feeling a strange mix of profound exhaustion and mild amusement. The screen did not stop at 7. It didn't even hesitate. Bah! The glass on the console cracked. A spiderweb fracture spread across the readout. "Joe." "Sure." "Security!" Blake screamed, scrambling backward until his back hit the far wall. His purple skin had drained to a sickly, pale gray. "Lock down the sector. We have a 10. By the Founders, it's a 10. Shuar." Sparks showered from the top of the Arbiter. The grinding hum turned into a violent, physical shudder. The machine, built to categorize the limits of galactic biology, was trying to quantify the boundless, irrational spite of the human spirit. It was trying to measure a species that would cut off its own leg to survive a cave-in, that would poison its own liver for fun, that would look up at the infinite void of space and decide to conquer it in tin cans held together by duct tape and hubris. The screen flickered violently, cycling through numbers too fast to read 13, 14, 15 before the display abruptly shorted out with a loud times pop. Smoke began to curl from the cracked glass. The massive metal structure groaned, the internal relays seizing up, locked in a logic loop they couldn't resolve. The room fell dead silent, save for the hiss of escaping steam. Bennett took the cigarette out of his mouth. He looked at the smoking, ruined console, then turned his gaze slowly to Administrator Blake, who was pressed flat against the wall, trembling violently. His massive black eyes locked on Bennett as if expecting him to unhinge his jaw and devour the room. Bennett sighed, running a hand through his greasy hair. "Look," Bennett said, his voice flat, exhausted, and perfectly calm. I don't know what just happened to your machine, but my manifold is leaking, my head is killing me, and I really need a cup of coffee. Are you going to stamp my damn visa? Or do I need to find someone else? The holding cell was entirely devoid of corners. It was a seamless, eggshell white sphere of composite resin that smelled aggressively of sanitized nothingness. There was no bench, no bed, no toilet. Just a smooth, curving floor that subtly adjusted its temperature to match the ambient heat of whoever sat on it. Bennett hated it. It felt like being trapped inside a giant, sterile ping-pong ball. He sat cross-legged in the center of the room, his grease-stained canvas boots resting against the pristine white floor. The headache that had started in the adjudication chamber had blossomed into a full-scale migraine, throbbing behind his eyes in time with his erratic heartbeat. He reached up, pressing the heel of his hand hard against his right temple, trying to manually compress the swollen blood vessels. His nose had finally stopped bleeding, but the blood had dried into a stiff, itchy crust on his upper lip and chin. He ran a rough, calloused thumb over it, feeling the grit. He was thirsty, a deep, raspy thirst that made his throat click every time he swallowed. He had been sitting in the sphere for what felt like 3 hours, though his internal clock was severely compromised by the station's artificial gravity and the lingering adrenaline crash. No one had come to offer him a towel. No one had offered him the coffee he had demanded. Outside the transparent, reinforced barrier that served as the cell door, the corridor was dead, empty. The ambient lighting had been shifted to a dim, emergency amber. Finally, the faint hiss of atmospheric equalization broke the silence. 2 figures stepped into the amber light of the corridor. One was Administrator Blake, looking distinctly more haggard than before. His purple, parchment-like skin was mottled with splotches of anxious gray, and his mandibles twitched erratically against his steel translation collar. The other alien was new. He was shorter than Blake, stockier, with skin the color of wet slate and eyes that were hidden behind thick, dark optical lenses. Unlike Blake's bureaucratic robes, this new alien wore a heavy, segmented suit of kinetic dampening armor. The matte black plating was thickest around the neck, and vital organs, humming with a low, barely audible frequency that made Bennett's teeth ache. The translator behind Bennett's ear crackled to life, rendering the armored alien's guttural vocalizations into a crisp, authoritative voice. "I am Director Reed," the alien said. He did not step close to the glass. He stood a full 10 feet back, his armored hands resting near a bulky device on his belt that looked uncomfortably like a plasma sidearm. "I oversee biological security for this transit hub. You are Bennett of the Terran species." Bennett didn't stand up. He just shifted his weight, wincing as his stiff knees popped. "I'm Bennett of the Freighter Time's Dusty Wake, and I've been sitting in this bubble for hours. If I'm under arrest for breaking your machine, you need to contact the Terran consulate. If I'm not, I need to get back to my ship before my chief engineer tries to bypass a fused manifold with duct tape and blows us all to hell." Reed did not acknowledge the complaint. He pulled a slim, transparent data slate from his armored thigh pouch. The screen was cracked, a physical manifestation of the corrupted data downloaded from the ruined Arbiter. "The Arbiter is not a machine that breaks, Bennett," Reed said, his voice flat, though the translator caught a subtle tremor of strain. "It is a quantum analytical engine. It models biological limits. It broke because your physiological and psychological data forced it into a recursive paradox." Bennett sighed, leaning back on his hands. The floor yielded slightly under his palms, a terrible, spongy sensation. "I stood on a plate. I didn't do anything. Your brain chemistry did it for you," Reed countered, taking a single, hesitant step forward. He tapped the cracked screen. "We managed to extract the fragmented logic loops before the core melted. The Arbiter could not categorize your species because your survival mechanisms contradict the fundamental laws of galactic biology. We eat, we sleep, we breathe oxygen," Bennett said dryly. "We're not that complicated." "You are a walking contradiction," Reed snapped, his slate-gray skin flushing darker. "The machine analyzed your cellular regeneration. Your cells degrade and replicate with built-in obsolescence. You age rapidly, You are prone to thousands of autoimmune failures. Yet, your response to catastrophic trauma is to flood your fragile nervous system with neurotoxins that suppress pain, allowing you to operate at maximum efficiency while your body is actively dying. Reed looked up from the slate, his dark lenses fixing on Bennett. That is not a survival trait of a prey species. That is the biological failsafe of a bespoke biological weapon designed to complete a mission at the cost of its own life. Bennett let out a short, harsh bark of laughter. The sound echoed off the seamless walls, sounding hollow and strange. A biological weapon? Buddy, I have a bad back from sleeping on a cheap mattress, and my knees pop when it rains. I'm an underpaid mechanic. Whoever designed me as a weapon did a remarkably half-assed job. Blake leaned in, whispering something frantic to Reed, his mandibles clicking rapidly. Reed waved him off. The physical fragility only deepens the paradox, Reed continued, his tone turning grim. The psychological profile is what destroyed the processing core. The Arbiter measures predatory aggression. Apex predators conquer through overwhelming physical superiority, or venom. They dominate because they are safe. But humans, Reed paused, staring through the thick glass at the exhausted, dirty man sitting on the floor. The Arbiter found that human aggression does not stem from dominance, Reed said softly. It stems from spite. It stems from a profound, terrifying refusal to accept biological reality. When faced with an insurmountable threat, your brain does not trigger submission. It triggers escalation. The machine ran simulations based on your memories. It modeled a scenario where your homeworld was invaded by a superior force. Bennett stopped smiling. His eyes narrowed, the cynical exhaustion fading into a cold, hard stare. "And?" Bennett asked, his voice dropping an octave. "A rational species surrenders to preserve its population," Reed said, his voice shaking slightly. The Arbiter concluded that humanity would burn its own planet to ash, irradiate its own atmosphere, and salt its own earth just to deny the enemy the victory. It classified your capacity for mutually assured destruction not as a tragic failure of diplomacy, but as a primary tactical doctrine. The silence in the corridor was absolute. Bennett stared at the two aliens. He felt a weird, twisted knot in his stomach. He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell them they were wrong. That humans were peaceful. That they were explorers and poets and scientists. But he thought of Sullivan in the dark, bleeding out, begging Bennett to cut his leg off. He thought of the colonial wars, the orbital bombardments over resource rights, the desperate, bloody history of a species that clawed its way out of the mud by killing anything that tried to keep it there. "We do what we have to do," Bennett said quietly. The sarcasm was gone from his voice. It was just raw, tired truth. The universe doesn't hand out free passes. You adapt, or you die in the dark. If that breaks your machine, then maybe your machine doesn't understand how the universe actually works. Reed lowered the data slate. The humming of his kinetic armor seemed louder now. "The galaxy is ordered, Bennett. There is a hierarchy of biology, predators and prey. We understand the monsters that hide in the dark. We have weapons to fight them." Reed stepped up to the glass, close enough that Bennett could see the intricate, terrified dilation of his pupils behind the optical lenses. "But you are not a monster," Reed whispered, the translator catching the visceral dread in his tone. "You are soft flesh and fragile bone. You bleed easily. You break easily. But you do not stop. That is what the Arbiter could not quantify. It rated you a level 7 threat, and then it realized that your capacity for violence is constrained only by your imagination. And your imagination is boundless." Reed turned away, gesturing to the control panel on the wall. "We are releasing you," Reed said, his back turned. "The quarantine is lifted. The holding protocols are insufficient anyway. If the machine is correct, no cage on this station could hold you if you truly decided you wanted to leave." The amber lights in the corridor shifted back to a harsh, clinical white. The invisible barrier at the front of the cell vanished with a soft, electronic chime. Bennett didn't move immediately. He looked down at his trembling hands, the grease working its way permanently into his cuticles. He didn't feel like an apex predator. He felt like a guy who had been pushed too far, too many times. He slowly climbed to his feet, his joints protesting loudly. He wiped his hands on his stained jumpsuit, walked out of the cell, and stood next to the heavily armored Director Reed. Bennett was a full head, shorter than the alien, physically unremarkable in every way. "My ship," Bennett said, his voice raspy. "I have a decoupled manifold. I need 3 yards of thermal-resistant conduit, a welding torch, and my transit visa stamped. And I want that cup of coffee." Blake looked at Reed. Reed nodded once. A stiff, jerky motion. "It will be waiting at your airlock," Reed said. "Take it, and leave our sector. Do not return." The walk back to the docking bays was a masterclass in psychological isolation. Usually a galactic transit hub of this size was a chaotic, deafening bazaar of interspecies commerce. Thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds moving through sweeping, vaulted corridors, trading goods, arguing over tariffs, breathing a dozen different, synthesized atmospheres. Today, the promenade was a ghost town. Bennett walked slowly, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the polished metal grating. His headache was receding, replaced by a deep, bone-weary numbness. Behind him, flanked at a distance of 20 paces, walked 4 station security officers in full combat armor. They carried heavy plasma rifles, but their weapons weren't raised. They held them across their chests, tight and defensive, like shields. As he walked past the massive, sweeping observation windows looking out into the station's commercial districts, Bennett noticed the movement. The aliens hadn't entirely evacuated. They had just retreated. Behind heavy glass doors, inside sealed restaurants and trading posts, hundreds of faces pressed against the transparent barriers. They were watching him. Bennett kept his eyes forward, but his peripheral vision caught their reactions. He didn't see awe. He didn't see the respect accorded to a conquering warrior race. He saw primal, instinctive terror. Mothers were physically shielding their young. Large, armored species that could have crushed Bennett's skull with 2 fingers were backing away from the glass as he passed. The atmosphere was thick, with the silent, suffocating stench of fear. Word had spread. The creature that broke the Arbiter. The apex predator wrapped in a fragile, fleshy shell. Bennett dug into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled, damp cigarette he had abandoned in the adjudication chamber. He smoothed it out with his thumb, clamped it between his lips, and finally managed to get his cheap plastic lighter to spark. He took a long, ragged drag, filling his lungs with harsh, acrid smoke. He knew smoking in the promenade was a severe violation of station environmental laws. He glanced back at the heavily armed security detail, following him. They watched the smoke curl from his lips. None of them said a word. Pathetic. Bennett muttered around the filter, blowing a stream of gray smoke into the pristine air. He finally reached Docking Bay 42. The heavy blast doors stood open. At the end of the pressurized umbilical tube, the rusted, pitted airlock of the Time's dusty wake times waited. To the rest of the galaxy, the freighter was a hazard, a barely space-worthy hunk of salvaged metal held together by outdated welding and stubbornness. To Bennett, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Sitting on the floor just outside the airlock was a heavy Durasteel crate. Sitting on top of the crate was a large, insulated thermal mug. Bennett walked up to the crate, ignoring the security detail that halted at the entrance of the umbilical. He picked up the mug. It was hot. He popped the lid. The rich, bitter smell of black coffee drifted up, masking the sterile odor of the station. He took a sip. It was terrible, likely synthesized from a chemical database rather than brewed from a bean, but it was hot, and it had caffeine. He keyed the airlock code. The heavy metal door groaned, grinding on its tracks, and slid open. The smell of the Time's dusty wake times hit him like a physical blow. It was a chaotic, aggressive symphony of odors. Ozone, stale sweat, spilled engine coolant, burnt toast, and the distinct, sharp tang of localized radiation. The gravity was a little too heavy, and the lighting was a dim, flickering yellow. It was imperfect. It was messy. It was human. "Benny? That you?" Davis poked his head down the access ladder from the upper engineering deck. He was a wiry man with grease smeared across his forehead and a wrench gripped tightly in his left hand. "Where the hell have you been?" "We got a comms alert that the whole sector went into lockdown. I had to threaten the dockmaster to keep them from unclamping our mooring lines." Bennett picked up the heavy crate of supplies, hoisting it onto his shoulder with a grunt of exertion. His back twinged sharply, a reminder of his fragile, failing biology. "I got held up at customs," Bennett said, stepping into the airlock and hitting the cycle button. The station doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the terrified, armored security guards. "Customs?" Davis scrambled down the ladder, taking the crate from Bennett's shoulder. He looked at the pristine, thermal-resistant conduit inside. "How the hell did you afford this?" "This is military grade. They gave it to us," Bennett said, taking another sip of the terrible coffee. He walked past Davis, heading toward the mess hall. He needed to sit down on a chair that wasn't a perfectly sanitized sphere. "Consider it an expedited departure fee. They want us out of their space, immediately." Davis frowned, trailing behind him. "Why? Did you insult someone?" Bennett stopped in the narrow, cluttered hallway. He looked at his reflection in the dull metal panel of a junction box. He looked terrible. His skin was pale, his eyes were bloodshot and sunken, and dried blood was flaking off his chin. He looked like a man who had barely survived a bar fight, not a creature capable of planetary extinction. He thought about the cracked screen of the Arbiter. He thought about the numbers cycling upward into infinity, trying to quantify a spirit that simply refused to break. The galaxy was a cold, logical place. It operated on math and biological certainty. It didn't understand the messy, agonizing, spiteful beauty of survival. It didn't understand that true strength wasn't about being indestructible. It was about bleeding, breaking, and deciding to keep walking anyway. They were terrified of humanity, not because humans were monsters, but because humans were survivors. And to a galaxy that had never truly had to suffer, survival looked exactly like insanity. Bennett turned away from the reflection and clapped Davis on the shoulder. "I didn't insult them, Davis," Bennett said, a tired, genuine smile cracking the dried blood on his face. "I just took a test. Come on, let's patch that manifold. We're going home." The Arbiter's core shattered, unable to measure humanity's boundless will to survive. What happens when the galaxy realizes our greatest weapon isn't our biology, but our terrifying, unyielding spite? If you want more grounded, raw sci-fi stories that explore the gritty reality of human endurance, smash that like button, share this video with your fellow apex predators, and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below. What everyday human trait would terrify an alien AI the most? See you next time.